How do you do, fellow kids? Today, I want to do something a little different. I want to talk about all the moralizing high horse gasbags and leftfluencers out there who are so eager to throw our boy, Noam Chomsky, under the bus for doing nothing wrong. And let me tell you, when I sat down to write this originally, I was going to do a much softer defense of Noam Chomsky. But then when I just did the basic homework to check over the facts, what he said, the emails with Epstein, in the context of the timeline, it just became very clear that these people who are throwing Chomsky under the bus haven't done their basic homework. And you guys should all be ashamed of yourselves, and everyone who's watching them should be very skeptical about anything they have to say going forward. I'm going to go into the ins and outs of all the events and the emails and the statements in their proper contexts. But before that, speaking of context, I just did an episode where I talked about the various obstacles to success of the left. And one problem that I focused on is elitism on the left, and how in recent years, much of what's called the left, quote unquote, has turned away from being an egalitarian political movement and towards becoming an elitist, moralizing religion, which actually supports the dominant system while pretending to oppose it, and whose ultimate underlying goal is just to advance the cultural dominance and status of a certain class of people who work in the cultural sphere. People in academia, especially humanities, people in entertainment and arts, advertising, news media. In other words, the culture industry, or the intellectuals, the people who shape how we understand the world. And these are the people that Noam Chomsky has always been a legendary critic of. And in my last episode, I made an analogy between our intellectual classes and the clergy of medieval times in Europe and in other world empires and kingdoms like in the Muslim world. And in these empires, the clergy's ultimate job was to convince the peasants to keep giving their grain to the ruling classes and never to rebel. And this was done under the guise of religion and morality. And the ruling nobility, well, they supported the clergy, and they gave them special privileges, and they paid them because they were providing them this service. So this clergy of our day, the intellectual classes who work in the corporations and in elite academia and in news media, over the last several decades, but especially over the last 10 years or so, they've taken anti-authoritarian ideas, left-wing ideas, which are extremely popular and have been since the 1960s, and these ideas which are a threat to established power, like being against racism and being against male domination and being against imperialism and all the rest. And then they took these ideas and they morphed them and perverted them into these bizarro, upside-down, elite-friendly versions of all these left-wing ideas, which are not a threat to established power. And they use the language of the left, of gender equality, of political equality, etc., mostly as a means to divide people from each other, to make us afraid of each other, to promote narcissism and fear and conformity, and to promote the dominance of the intellectual class, who are the ones who get to tell people what they can and can't do, and what words we can and can't say, and who to worship and who to hate, like Noam Chomsky. And then they use cancel culture to enforce all of this, to enforce their own dominance. In other words, all of this is right-wing hierarchy politics, but disguised as left-wing politics. It's promoting the interests of the rich and powerful and the clergy class, but using all the left-wing words which are about promoting the interests of the lower classes, of everybody else. And because most of us don't have any experience with participating in any actual politics, especially in countries where there's just first-past-the-post electoral systems, where it's a lot harder to participate, we feel very powerless. And it's easy for us to get tricked into feeling like politics is just about showing everyone that you're the good guy, and you believe all the good guy things, and you hate all the right bad guys. I have a friend who moved from a first-past-the-post country, Canada, to a country in Europe with 20 political parties that are very easy to participate in, and she calls the politics that we have here brand of me politics. What does my social media profile look like? And not, what am I actually doing to change anything? And this social media narcissism really plays into this neo-clergy type of fake leftist politics that I'm talking about. Especially because we spend so much time in front of computers and on social media, where everyone is watching us, and there's a record of everything we've said and everything we've liked. So we're incentivized to always be afraid of ever making a mistake, of liking the wrong person, liking the wrong tweets, and we're all afraid of crossing the lines of the cancel cult in case we become a target. Oh, why didn't you put a black square on your Instagram? Why didn't you say fuck ICE yet? Where's your Gaza atrocity reels? So we're not super incentivized to really investigate when someone is being accused of something. Better to join in the witch hunt than to take a risk and defend somebody who everyone else is piling up on. Now, I'm talking about this because I think that the way that people are treating Noam Chomsky right now is an outgrowth of all of this toxic crap that has been destroying left-wing politics for the last 10 years. Now, before we look at what Chomsky supposedly did that's so bad that he needs to be publicly disavowed by every cowardly, showboating wanker gasbag leftfluencer out there, let's put the guy's career and his relations with Epstein into some context. First, his career. So today, it's completely standard on the left to be the most extreme critic of Israel and to show solidarity with the Palestinians. Chomsky was out there giving talks, exposing Israel's abuses, and he was giving us the Palestinian human rights perspective already in 1973, when there were about 0 prominent people taking the side of the Palestinians in any way, including on the left, outside of a couple of Arab Palestinian scholars who no one took seriously because they were Arab Palestinian scholars. The only way anyone would even think about listening to anything from the Palestinian point of view was if it was coming from a Jewish person. And Noam Chomsky was that Jewish person. He was the only Jewish person, the only non-Arab person of any prominence. And he was constantly smeared as a self-hating Jew and an anti-Semite and all this nonsense. And he had to walk around with a security team when he gave talks on this subject in the early days. And it was the same thing when it came to his activism on the Vietnam War. He was out there giving talks against the war when there was no mass anti-war movement, and when being against the war was extremely unpopular and a scandalous position to have. And it got him arrested several times, and it put him on Richard Nixon's enemies list, like Steve Buscemi and Billy Madison. And this was at a time when it was common for anti-war speakers and meetings to be violently chased out and broken up, the OG college campus deplatforming. And when that happened, the media would write about these attacks approvingly. Chomsky was a critic of cancel culture in the 2010s and the 2020s because he was the victim of cancel culture from the 1960s on. Slander, deplatforming, harassment, calls to punish him and fire him. He was getting that for decades. Until recently, when it became okay to like him for 10 minutes in mainstream media on a couple of occasions, like when he said that you should vote for Joe Biden instead of Trump in 2020, and when he was giving shit to people who didn't get COVID vaccines around the same time. And I'm also talking about this cancel culture stuff because Chomsky's disdain for cancel culture actually plays a central role in the story with Epstein, as we'll see shortly. And another thing about Chomsky is that he's just done such a great job at helping people to understand what the hell is going on in the world around us. And he was doing this at a time when there was very little access to alternative viewpoints. Like, if you wanted a different take on news and politics than what you learned on the 4 TV channels that existed, or in school, or in the newspapers, you had to go out in the library and read books at random. Or you had to buy Z magazine when that came out in the 1990s. For decades, there was basically just Noam Chomsky and Michael Parenti and maybe Howard Zinn, and that was it. So there's this one guy out there offering different perspectives. And he's not just sitting there pontificating from his office, writing tweets in his underwear. He was out there on tour 24/7 IRL analog, like Bob Dylan's Forever Tour. And he was answering every snail mail and then every email like a complete lunatic, or like a person who really cared about teaching and helping people. And he wasn't racking up speaking fees for any of this. He was doing all this stuff for free, nonstop, for decades, just out of a sense of obligation to let people know what's going on, and more importantly, to motivate people to do something about it. And that's what's so powerful about Noam Chomsky's message. His message has always been that you have the power to change things, which is what I always say on my show, because I'm very inspired by Noam Chomsky. And that's how change has always happened. People join organizations, people lobby their representatives, they do civil disobedience, they do strikes, they do more intense things than that. And that's how we got everything that we have today, by getting together and making it happen, by demanding it under threat, by making it the least worst option for people in power, and on some occasions actually taking power for ourselves. And it's not an easy message to know what to do with, because nowadays people have become so atomized that we don't even know what it means anymore to lobby for something, or to organize in a group, or even to socialize with a group of people. And this is something that we're going to talk about a lot more in the future, how we move forward in the conditions of the 21st century. But even today, Chomsky's message is the only one that makes any sense. The other messages that you get today are do nothing, you're powerless, nothing works, just die alone, which is the message that you get on the right and on the center, or just let the technocrats take care of it. And very often you get the same message on the left. There's no point, there's no future, there's nothing we can do. Or else on the fake left, you also get another nihilistic message, which is join a cult. Whether it's a burn the witch type of SJW cult, or it's a Trotskyist or Stalinist cult based on a politics model from the 20th century third world that has a very mixed record at best and has no application whatsoever in the Western first world democratic countries, especially in our modern era of mass surveillance. So Chomsky's message for the past 60 years has been, don't be nihilistic, don't join in a dead-end cult, don't give up, go join a group, go get involved in politics, go meet other people and do something about the things you care about, expand democracy, make life better for everyone, which is what the vast majority of people want anyways, whether they define themselves as being on the left or right or center or whatever it is. Now, this isn't an easy infantile message about Uncle Stalin or Papa Smurf or Papa Trump will come down and save the day for you, but it is the truth. And the truth is liberating because it allows you to act in ways that actually work. So it would be just a huge loss to cancel Chomsky and to discredit him and his politics over what I think is basically nothing. Especially at a time like now, when we need those kind of ideas and to expand and advance those ideas more than ever. And him getting cancelled is a huge boon to the powers that be, and also to all the gremlins in left-wing disguise in the clergy class who hate any politics that doesn't involve themselves dictating all the terms. Ranting aside, let's look at what Chomsky is actually accused of doing. Why are these gasbag pompous showboaters telling us that Chomsky is a fallen hero, that he's betrayed his purported morals, that he's just so sick and nothing can excuse what he did? And I'm just straight up quoting titles of videos and articles against him here. What Chomsky did was that he made friends with the mascot of the American elite, Jeffrey Epstein, in 2015. And this is after Epstein had already been convicted of a sex crime against a minor in 2008. And even worse, they remained friends even after Epstein was accused and charged with much more serious crimes against minors in 2019. And Chomsky and Epstein weren't just acquaintances. They were actual friends. They exchanged emails a bunch of times. Epstein introduced Chomsky to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and to right-wing human sausage Steve Bannon. And they hung out for purely social reasons at least once to have dinner with Woody Allen, which was the time that we saw Chomsky on Epstein's jet. And the thing that people are most horrified by is that Chomsky even gave Epstein advice on how to deal with the attacks on Epstein when all the accusations were coming out against him in late 2018 and early 2019. So before we get into the details, let's look at the context. When Chomsky met Epstein in 2015, the extent of Epstein's crimes were not widely reported or known by most people. Now, maybe in cancel abuse cult circles, when you meet a new friend, you always do a full background check on them to see if they have a criminal record or if they've ever liked the wrong tweets, because you know that all your fake friends will use any excuse to throw you to the dogs if you're ever associated with the wrong cooties-infected person. But normal human beings do not behave that way. Even if Chomsky did research all of his friends like some kind of lunatic, he probably wouldn't have found out very much about Epstein. Because of Epstein's connections, he got convicted of the least serious possible offense. And he also got a sweetheart sentence, and the press mostly whitewashed what he actually did. Now, when Chomsky met Epstein in 2015, Epstein was a regular figure in attendance at MIT science-related events. Epstein often hosted these events. He often gave people funding. By all accounts, Epstein was very intelligent, very knowledgeable on a whole range of subjects, very curious and engaging and charming, like many glib sociopaths are. As far as people would have known, he was just one of these billionaire guys who hangs around academic circles or art circles, funding their research and all that so he can have friends. Because of exploding inequality, you have a lot of these guys nowadays, especially in academia and in the arts, where people need patrons and funding, and lonely billionaires need friends and girlfriends. And they get way more space and respect than they deserve because they have this money. So if Chomsky knew anything, like through the MIT gossip grapevine, all he would have known at that point was that Epstein was a guy who tried to pick up a 17-year-old hooker 8 years earlier, and that he went to easy mode jail. Now, for those of you who think that even this is so unacceptable, that talking to Epstein would be beyond the pale, like, have you ever heard of the "she told me she was 25" excuse? Part of Epstein's 2008 defense in court was that the sex workers or their pimps were lying to him about their age. So we would assume that that's exactly what he told people about it if it ever came up. And as Chomsky pointed out when he was asked about this in 2023, he said, quote, "We knew that he had been convicted and served his time, which means that he re-enters society under prevailing norms." Unquote. And he'd made a few similar comments, including one in an email exchange with a random person, where Chomsky pointed out that, quote, "There's an old principle, particularly on the left, but much more broadly, that someone who has served a sentence re-enters society without prejudice." Unquote. And that's not just a left-wing principle, it's scientifically proven to be good for society. Studies show that people who come out of prison and are socially integrated have a much lower recidivism rate than people who are ostracized and isolated, as long as their social reintegration is not taken as a sign of acceptance of their criminal behavior. And that's another reason why cancel culture is just so stupid and awful. And also, when I was a teenager in 1993, Jerry Seinfeld was dating a 17-year-old girl. And I remember it wasn't even scandalous. It was just like being reported like, "Hey, here's Seinfeld's new girlfriend. And she goes to high school. And she wants to be a veterinarian. And she likes My Little Ponies." And they dated for 4 years. And that was considered normal not so long ago. Today it seems insane. Like, can you imagine what Seinfeld and his girlfriend would even talk about? Like, "Hey, Shoshana, did you catch the latest Scooby-Doo? Can you believe that giant wombat monster was actually the janitor wearing a rubber costume? Let's ask your parents if we can have sex after eating Chef Boyardee for supper. Do you want to do it in your Barbie canopy bed? Or we can go to my place and do it in my bed that looks like a race car." And Chomsky is 25 years older than Seinfeld, so that would probably seem even less crazy to someone of his generation. More context. Why did Chomsky become more than casual acquaintances with Epstein in the first place? Why did they become friends? In 2015, 87-year-old Chomsky was in deep doo-doo. He discovered that he had, quote, "inconsistencies in his retirement resources that threatened his economic independence and caused him great distress," unquote. That's according to his current wife, Valeria. Apparently, after his first wife, Carol, got ill with cancer, and he was left in charge of the finances, he did a crap job with it. And his retirement money was all a big mess. And this also involved a dispute with his kids about some of their mom's property, which he described to someone as one of the worst things that ever happened to him. Now, it's not clear to me if Chomsky and his late wife were both bad with money, or if they had one of those traditional relationships where the wife does all the practical stuff so the man can be a rock star, superstar academic and political activist and answer 50,000 emails every week, and he doesn't know how to cook an egg. But either way, he was in trouble. And he's having a very hard time with it, and it's in that context that Epstein, who is a well-known, well-liked money guy in MIT circles, he gets introduced to Chomsky to help him out with that mess. And so Epstein swoops in and helps him recover $270,000 of his own retirement money, and he gets his finances in order and helps him deal with a dispute with his kids. And the fact that the kids are fighting with him over money is way more disturbing to me than his friendship with Epstein. Even though I don't know anything about the dispute with kids, and I don't want to know anything about the dispute with the kids because it's not my fucking business. So, what happens to normal, good-natured human beings when someone shows up and helps you in one of the most difficult times in your life? Especially if that person is charming and friendly and knowledgeable in a whole bunch of fields that you're interested in. You feel grateful towards them, and you start to trust them. So Epstein and Chomsky had some kind of friendship where they exchanged a bunch of emails and they hung out at least 2 or 3 times. And Epstein introduces him to Woody Allen and Ehud Barak and Steve the Carnotzal Bannon. And I know a lot of you cult brain morons out there are like, oh my god, he wanted to meet a prime minister of Israel, the literal apartheid state, and Steve the sodium nitrite sausage Bannon, a literal fascist? Noam Chomsky's job was talking about these people and what they do. Can you imagine, like a journalist or a historian, being told, hey, you can interview Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot or Steve Bannon or Donald Trump? And the journalist is like, no way, I don't talk to fascists. I already know everything there is to know about everything. I don't need to talk to anyone. Black lives matter. If that's you, remind me not to hire you for anything. And there's also just the element of curiosity. You don't want to meet Ehud Barak and get the inside scoop on what was going on at Oslo and Taba, where Israel and Palestine almost made peace? If you're interested in that, then why wouldn't you want to have that meeting? And like Chris Knight, who's been a big critic of Chomsky for decades, points out in a recent article about Chomsky, Chomsky worked as a professor at MIT, where all the CIA directors and Department of Defense people were coming from, and all the people were doing research on missile technology and all this awful stuff. And Chomsky basically thought that these people were war criminals. But he was always friendly with those people. Because why not? You have to live. Michael Albert, who worked with Chomsky for decades, and who founded Z Magazine and ZNet, and he invented Paracon, he commented that Chomsky is, quote, curious, and given the chance, he wanted to learn things useful to his work of dismantling lies and violence. When face to face, even with the devil, Noam Chomsky would be civil. It was his way, unquote. And when asked by one of his fans or people corresponding to him by email about his association with Epstein, Chomsky responded, quote, I've met all sorts of people, including major war criminals. I don't regret having met any of them, unquote. And this whole thing about not having anyone to do with anyone who has the wrong politics or who's an evil person always shocks me. Like when these idiots want to shut down popular right-wing speakers on their campus, like Jordan Peterson or Charlie Kirk or whatever. If you're an activist and you want to actually do something positive in the world and change people's minds, you should be actively going to these events and listening to exactly those kind of people. How are you supposed to be communicating with the general public and changing people's minds if you have no idea what they think and what kind of messages are persuading them? So it was like an essential part of Chomsky's work to get to know these people, and it gave him important insights that most of us are not lucky to have the opportunity to have. Now, is it possible that socializing with these people maybe dulled Chomsky's spidey sense about someone like Epstein? It's definitely possible. But then again, not long after socializing with Sausage Steve Bannon, he went on to give a speech where he called Bannon the impresario of the ultranationalist reactionary international movement. He's not pulling his punches. There are trade-offs when you socialize with bigwigs, and journalists deal with this all the time. Your natural instinct is to be less critical of people that you know. But at the same time, it's important to know that most of the people who do horrible things in this world are not Darth Vader cartoons. They're real people who can be very nice to their kids and their cats and their friends, but then horrible to the Cherokee or the Palestinians or the Jews or the slaves. I don't think Chomsky was pulling any punches, but regardless, that's why we read different authors. If you want to read someone who has zero potential for corruption because he's above socializing with the bad guys, then read Norman Finkelstein. He alienates everyone he meets, even his friends. And that's why he's one of the few people who has been cancelled by both the pro-Israel people and the pro-Palestine activists, which I totally respect him for. Say what you will about him, but he's a mensch. And he's not there to kiss anyone's ass. But any writer or thinker or anyone has different pluses and minuses. That's why you want to be reading a variety of sources on any subject. Now we get to the really contentious stuff. So in late November 2025, Julie K. Brown starts publishing her in-depth articles about Epstein and exposing the seriousness of his crimes and the evidence about them. And we can see from the emails that Chomsky is still friends with Epstein for at least a few months after those articles come out. And the thing that people can't get over is that Chomsky actually advised Epstein to ignore the press and what he considered to be the unfair attacks against him. So on December 18th, 2018, which is like 3 weeks after the first Miami Herald article, in response to Epstein complaining about his bad press coverage, Chomsky writes to Epstein, quote, "We've seen some of it, some of the press. Disgusting, particularly in this culture of gossip mongers. I've had plenty of experience with defamation over the years. Holocaust denier, secret agent of the CIA, dedicated liar, etc. There are books, articles, websites devoted to denouncing me in the most vicious terms. My feeling and experience is that there's virtually no point in responding. It just leads to renewed attacks. And to 99% of the people who will never look into the matter, the conclusion is that where there's smoke, there's fire." Which is exactly how cancel culture works, by the way. And then Chomsky goes on. "These things have a half-life. The best reaction, I think, is to just stay above the furor, wait it out, go on with what matters. Like real friendship, deep and sincere and everlasting, from both of us, Noam and Valeria. You are truly America's greatest dad, Bill Cosby." This is obviously super embarrassing. But given all that we know about the seriousness and the number of allegations against Epstein, it doesn't really seem like it's a ride it out, everything will be fine situation now, does it? It seems pretty clear that while Chomsky might have seen the press coverage of Epstein, it doesn't seem like he actually read any of it. And then there's the email that really drives everyone nuts a couple of months later. So on February 23rd, 2019, 3 months after the first Miami Herald articles come out, Epstein writes to Chomsky at 4:27 a.m. It's like Donald Trump. "Noam, I'd love your advice on how I handle my putrid press. It is spiraling out of control. Do I have someone write an op-ed, defend myself, or try to ignore, realizing that mobs are dangerous?" And Epstein knows what he's accused of. Like, he's obviously manipulating Chomsky here. And then Chomsky responds with the almost exact same advice that he gave a couple of months earlier. He says, quote, "I've watched the horrible way you are being treated in the press and public. It's painful to say, but I think the best way to proceed is to ignore it. I've had plenty of experience, though of course not on this scale. A Google search will bring up tons of hysterical accusations of all sorts, even groups devoted to vilifying me. I pay no attention unless I'm approached for a comment on a specific matter. It's a nuisance, but it's the best way. The same conclusions from experiences of others, in some cases close friends. What the vultures dearly want is a public response, which then provides a public opening for an onslaught of venomous attacks, many from just publicity seekers or cranks of all sorts, which are impossible to answer. How do you prove that you're not a neo-Nazi who wants to kill all the Jews, or a rapist, or whatever charge comes along? That's particularly true now with the hysteria that has developed about abuse of women. And this is the part that really drives everyone nuts. Which has reached the point that even questioning a charge is a crime worse than murder. For virtually everyone who sees any of this, the reaction will be, where there's smoke, there's fire, maybe raging fire. Whatever the facts, which few will even think of investigating. In general, it's best, I think, not to react unless directly questioned, particularly in the current mood, which, I presume, will fade away, even if not in time to prevent much torture and distress. Hard to say, but it's the best advice I can think of. Noam." Now, just to remind everyone what Epstein is being accused of, in Julie K. Brown's groundbreaking articles about Epstein that appeared 3 months before this email, she outlines how Epstein was running a global operation where he paid 13 and 14-year-old girls for sex, and then he offered them additional money to go recruit other teenage girls. And she identified like 80 women who alleged they were molested or sexually abused by Epstein in his various billionaire houses in the US and on his private island. This is not ignore it and it'll blow away type stuff. Noam Chomsky might have been 90 years old when this came out, but wasn't a fucking drooling idiot. It's like, hey, the police found 20 decapitated female bodies in the freezer in my garage in my human dissection laboratory, and the skulls are all mounted on my walls in trophy cases. What should I do? Chomsky writes back, oh, just ignore it, buddy. It'll blow over. Oh, these feminists are going way too far, am I right? It doesn't take mind-reading power to figure out that Chomsky was obviously not reading the press against his friend, and that he just assumed it was more cancel garbage. And this is probably what Epstein wanted Chomsky to think, so that he could get sympathy about it. This is very typical narcissist, psychopath, baby type behavior, manipulating your friends into thinking you're the victim. So what kind of lazy, disloyal, and straight up stupid fucking idiots are these people who are denouncing Chomsky when they obviously haven't even spent 10 seconds to think about the context of these emails, or to look into the timeline and what was in these articles and compare that to Chomsky's responses? And again, Chris Knight, in his recent critical article about Chomsky, points out that Chomsky told a friend that he was completely unaware of the more serious accusations against Epstein until after his arrest, which should be completely fucking obvious to anyone who has done their basic homework. And what really flips people out about these emails is that he's talking about the hysteria that has developed about the abuse of women. Like, oh my god, Chomsky thinks all concerns about abuse of women are fake. Chomsky is actually a sexist bro pickup artist guy. I bet he has a secret account where he likes Andrew Tate's tweets. And Chomsky must be ghostwriting Homath videos. And remember, this is early 2019. This is the peak of cancel culture garbage. This is when Me Too went from exposing predators like Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby and teaching men about all the stuff that women go through that we don't hear about, to canceling Aziz Ansari and making him disappear for 8 years and counting because he wanted to have a one-night stand with his date, and he was either being pushy or else he was not good at reading her nonverbal cues, while respecting her wishes when she expressed them verbally. Or the 19-year-old girl who tried to cancel 51-year-old Matthew Perry because she matched with him on a dating app. 2019 was the peak of overgrown rich toddlers in elite colleges in the US who pay $80,000 a year in tuition, testing the limits of how far they could exercise their power over their fellow students and teachers and administrators. Echoing the worst Israel lobby tactics, they were weaponizing their feelings of being unsafe to get teachers that they don't like fired, forcing them to resign, and terrorizing all their fellow students, and just shitting their diapers over and over, and trying to see if they could make any of the adults clean it up. And the adults did clean it up, so they just kept on shitting harder and harder with their terror tactics, doing right-wing politics of domination and censorship disguised as left-wing politics of equality. And in doing so, they made the idea of the left toxic to millions of people. And they turned people like Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson into podcast superstars because so many people felt that their own jobs were threatened by this type of gaslighting bullshit. And remember that Chomsky was still teaching and giving lectures, and he was still involved in campus life at this time, even though he was officially retired. So he had experience with this crap, and he was also hearing about it from a lot of his friends who weren't retired. I don't teach, but I still have heard a lot of these stories from my friends who are professors. And that's why Chomsky signed the Harper's Letter in 2020 in favor of free speech and against all of these right-wing, anti-democratic, gaslighting, cry-bully, intimidation politics, which ended up getting Donald Trump elected and which aided the ascent of right-wing goons all over the Western world. And I still find it extremely shameful and pathetic how few people on the left ended up signing that letter. You had like Chomsky and Cornel West, and that's about it as far as I remember. And it's not like Chomsky was against Me Too. He was just against the stupid part of Me Too, like almost everyone who wasn't insane was against. In an interview around the same time as the Epstein stuff, Chomsky said that Me Too, quote, grows out of a real and serious and deep problem of social pathology that has exposed it and brought it to attention. But at the same time, he cautioned about, quote, confusing allegation with demonstrated action, unquote. Just the basic norms of civilization. And if you want a sense of Chomsky's views on abuse of women, in a 2008 interview, Chomsky described porn as the humiliation and degradation of women, and he compares it to sweatshop labor and child abuse. And then when the interviewer asks him how we can improve the working conditions in porn, Chomsky responds that, quote, just like child abuse, you don't want to make it better child abuse. You want to stop child abuse. Suppose there's a starving child in the slums, and you say, well, I'll give you food if you let me abuse you. Is that an argument? The answer to that is stop the conditions in which the child is starving, and the same is true here. Eliminate the conditions in which women can't get decent jobs, not to permit abusive and destructive behavior." Unquote. He's saying empower women, and empower everyone so that they don't have to be forced to do shitty things. And you can debate whether or not porn or sex work is a shitty job compared to every other shitty job out there. Like, there are women who will argue on both sides of this issue, and often depends on their life experience and what type of sex work they're doing and the conditions. But also keep in mind that Chomsky is born in 1928. It's actually pretty impressive that he's not super sexist. So there's two ways of interpreting all this stuff, right? One way is like known telepath Chris Hedges decided to interpret it. His mind-reading abilities are so precise that he just had to release a video where he explains to us with complete Professor X confidence that Chomsky knew exactly what Epstein was all about. He says that a bunch of times in this video. He knew. But according to Hedges, Chomsky was just so enamored with going in a real private jet like MC Hammer style that he just didn't care about all those abused women. He just pushed it to the back of his mind so he could get in that pimp life. Hedges wants us to believe that Chomsky read all the articles about Epstein before he decides, bros before hoes, yo. These girls were asking for it. Then he calls up Epstein. He's like, yo, fuck all these haters and these whiny ass bitches. Yo, just keep on pimping. When are we hitting that plane? I want to go have lunch with Bill Cosby tonight. Free Bill Cosby. Yeah, wait. I read Chris Hedges and I listen to his YouTube posts, and he has a lot of interesting life experience with rich kids and as a war correspondent, and he's worth checking out. But he's also a fucking asshole. Like, the way our faces age says something about our disposition. Like, someone who smiles a lot gets smile lines. And someone like Chris Hedges is a fucking cranky-ass party pooper. He looks like a cranky bald eagle from the Muppets, because he permanently makes this face all day. And I can't be 100% sure, but I am 100% sure that Chris Hedges is not a telepath, and he does not know what Chomsky was thinking. And he did not even try very hard to understand the context of the whole affair. So, anyways, that's one interpretation, the Chris Hedges interpretation. Or you can have the other interpretation, is you could just give Chomsky the benefit of the doubt, which I think he deserves, and frankly anyone deserves, and we can instead assume that he wasn't actually reading the articles about Epstein. And remember, the emails always say, we saw the coverage. I saw how they're treating you, not I read the coverage. And his just ignore it and it will pass advice makes no freaking sense if he actually knew what was in those articles. And we can also assume that if he didn't read the articles, it probably wasn't because he didn't want to lose access to that pimp life on the jets. Oh no, if I find out the truth, then I won't get to hang out with ultra-nationalist dried sausage man anymore. I think we should assume something more realistic and more congruent with the actual facts, which is that Chomsky, having been through decades of cancel culture himself, and being the good-natured, trusting guy that he is, he trusted his friend, who helped him out at a very hard time. And he assumed that the attacks on Epstein were fake slander, and he didn't want to give himself a heart attack reading a bunch of garbage from the press. At the end of the day, even though we can't read minds, unlike Marvel superhero Chris Hedges, the evidence seems to point to the fact that Chomsky was guilty of having been a good friend. And I get it. Some of you guys have no idea what friends are or what loyalty is, and you love cancel culture, which also doesn't exist, and you'll try to get anyone in your social group canceled and fired if it benefits you. But if you're not in that cult, what kind of friend would you rather have? And what kind of person would you rather be? Like, ideally, we would always be perfect judges of character and always be right about everyone. But if you're going to make a mistake, would you rather be that person who made a mistake and stuck by someone out of loyalty, and later it turns out that they actually did something bad? Or would you rather be that person who throws your friend under the bus and then goes and makes a YouTube video about it, and then later it turns out that they didn't deserve it at all? Like, are you a person with a soul and who has principles and who cares about people to a fault? Or are you a cowering, quivering blob who always looks around to see what everyone else is thinking before you decide what to think? Do we always have to read every accusation against our friends and denounce them as soon as possible, just in case the whole world might read our private fucking emails one day? I'd love to see what's in your private fucking emails. So, maybe until we have proof to the contrary, or until we can hire the real Professor X to read Chomsky's mind for the Throw People Under the Bus Inquisition Committee, maybe we should just give him the benefit of the doubt and interpret the evidence in what also happens to be the most logical way. Do I think Noam Chomsky should have been friends with Epstein? No. Of course I don't think Noam Chomsky should have been friends with Jeffrey Epstein. Just like I think that your grandma should not have given her credit card number to that Nigerian prince. And just like I think my friend should not have been in a relationship with a married guy for 8 years until he got annoyed with her for being upset about it and then he dumped her and went back to his wife. Just like I think my other friend should not have sent his life savings to his fake Chinese girlfriend whom he had never met before over the internet. Just how I think my other friend should not have married a literal psychopath who stole all her money and her furniture. And just how I think several of my young women millennial friends should not have been dating these absolutely reprehensible fake feminist, non-binary serial manipulator guys who use left-wing language so they can bag vulnerable women and then convince them to be polyamorous when they don't actually want to, and then get the women to pay their rent. What's another word for an outspoken non-binary male feminist? Date rapist. Thank you very much. I'll be here all week. And actually, those fake non-binary feminist gaslighting guys are the perfect analogy for all the fake left-wing social justice politics that I've been criticizing are. They're that guy. They're using all the left-wing words to better molest you with. My point here is that good people get into close, intimate relationships way closer than Chomsky got with Epstein, as far as we know, with absolutely reprehensible, shitty people all the time without realizing it until it's too late. And sometimes we kind of judge them for it, and other times we just feel bad for them because we were fooled just like they were. But either way, we don't decide they're bad people for getting suckered. Speaking of the benefit of the doubt, this whole Epstein thing actually reminds me of another time that Chomsky made a bad call about a horrible person for understandable reasons. In the late 1970s, when reports were starting to come out about the Khmer Rouge Pol Pot genocide in Cambodia, which is one of the biggest mass murders and extermination campaigns of human beings in modern times, Chomsky also made a bad call. Because the Western media had the habit of exaggerating or inventing crimes when it came to communist countries and third world anti-imperialist guerrilla movements, Chomsky was skeptical about these reports, and he argued that they were probably exaggerated and they should be taken with a grain of salt. Chomsky was wrong, but it was an understandable mistake to make. Not because of willful blindness or because he loves communism so much that he'll excuse all the crimes done in the name of socialism, just like every Marxist-Leninist or Trotskyist cult victim out there does now on a daily basis. No. He's had no trouble in his career calling out human rights abuses of communist regimes in other situations, and he later acknowledged that he was wrong about Cambodia. But he's also always insisted that it was a reasonable mistake to make at that time, given the circumstances. But of course, the press trashed him and called him a genocide apologist and all the rest. They didn't think that he deserved the benefit of the doubt because they didn't want people listening to his other criticisms, where he was right about almost everything. They just wanted any excuse to destroy his credibility. So ask yourself, in whose interest is it to throw Chomsky under the bus and to throw 60 years of impactful, empowering activism into the garbage? Obviously, it serves the interest of the people who support the current status quo of American imperialism and massive wealth inequality and capitalism that he's been ferociously critiquing for 60 years. They certainly don't think he deserves the benefit of the doubt. And it also serves the posturing gasbags and performance artists, moral leftfluencers, whose main concern is looking like virtuous clerics, and they'd love to have people to throw under the bus so that they can look like they're superior. Oh, look at me, I'm better than Noam Chomsky. Watch these YouTube ads for legalized gambling. And there's another posturing group of right-wingers who thinks that Noam Chomsky doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. And that's because they also hate left-wing politics. And that's all the Leninist and Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyist cultists out there who are jumping on this anti-Chomsky train as an opportunity to wank on about how these emails prove that anarchism is bad and Leninism or Stalinism is good. And they've got this whole narrative now about how the fact that Michael Parenti couldn't get hired in academia while Chomsky had a stellar career where he's palling around with billionaires like Jeffrey Epstein, that this proves once and for all that Stalinism and Trotskyism, that's vindicated, and that Chomsky's girly anarchism wasn't a real threat to the powers that be, but Parenti's macho Leninist politics, that's the real threat, and that's why you need to join our cult. And for those of you who don't know him, Michael Parenti was like the only other popular left-wing voice that people were likely to encounter in the wastelands of the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. And I want to go on a little side quest with this because I've seen so much gloating about it on the pseudo-left-wing kindergarten cult web. First of all, let me explain something to you guys. The reason that Chomsky was able to keep his job and become a successful academic and Parenti wasn't has nothing to do with their respective politics, which honestly were very, very similar, especially from the point of view of people in power. They were both outspoken socialists who spent their free time running around lecturing and writing books about the horrors of American foreign policy and capitalism and criticizing the intellectual class. And I hate to tell you guys, but the difference between anarchism and Bolshevism to a university administrator or to the FBI is about zero. And nowadays, when the Cold War is long gone, Chomsky's message of massive popular organizing is much more threatening to the established powers that be than the idea of some incel neckbeard clowns organizing a revolutionary cosplay party, which is like the easiest thing possible to infiltrate and sabotage in these days of internet and mass surveillance. Like, can we get some actual ideas about how to organize for the conditions of the 21st century instead of 1850 or 1917? The reason that Chomsky was able to thrive in his career, while Parenti never held a stable long-term professorship, had everything to do with the simple fact that Chomsky started his activism after he got tenure at MIT, and Parenti started his before he had tenure anywhere. It's not very complicated. Plus, it also has a little bit to do with the relative stature of the two academics and also which fields they were teaching in. So on tenure, Chomsky was out campaigning against the Vietnam War several years before it became socially acceptable at all. But in 1967, when he published the Responsibility of Intellectuals article, which attacked the intellectual class for being servants of power instead of critics of power, specifically in terms of supporting the Vietnam War, and this article was the first article that brought him to prominence as an activist, at that point, Chomsky had already been tenured for 5 or 6 years. Parenti was a few years younger than Chomsky, I think 5 or 6 years. So he was doing his activism when it was already very popular on campuses in the late 1960s, and there was already a growing anti-war movement. But when he got arrested for protesting in 1970, he didn't have tenure yet. After his arrest, his teaching contract was ending, and his department voted unanimously to renew it, but the administration refused, and they let his contract expire. And they were backed or pressured to do that by donors and local politicians. And after that, Parenti got short-term teaching gigs here and there, but he always got refused tenure-track positions. And then he had to work at left-wing think tanks and activist groups to get by for the rest of his life. Also, Chomsky was already an academic superstar when he got his tenure and when he started his activism. He was basically the founder of a whole new paradigm in the field of linguistics, while Parenti was just one more radical poli-sci professor in the late 1960s and early 70s. So it would have been much harder to completely blacklist Chomsky from all the universities across the country than it was the case with Parenti. And importantly, and I think this is relevant, Chomsky was teaching in a field that had almost nothing to do with politics. Having Chomsky teach linguistics wasn't as much of a threat to the MIT campus because he wasn't turning his elite students into radicals. He was turning everyone else into radicals after hours. And Michael Parenti was an excellent lecturer and writer, but he was teaching political science, a field that's all about ideology. If you're training the next generation of the modern clergy, the intellectuals who write about politics and whose job it is to justify the power of the elites and every horrible war that they engage in, you can't train them with radical politics that will be effective against the ruling class, especially not in elite colleges. Those types of fields, the humanities, are much more tightly policed, especially at a time of war. And especially when it came to the practical type of politics that Chomsky and Parenti advocated. They weren't just masturbators like all the Post-Modernists and the stupid Marxist-Leninists. They actually encouraged real popular activism and organizing. In the 1970s, the universities and the donor class were having a tough time because after World War II, colleges became accessible to students from the working class and lower middle class for the first time. And working class kids were naturally pretty left-wing, and they were also very practical-minded. They wanted real change that could improve their lives and the lives of the communities where they came from. They wanted more democracy and more economic equality and less foreign imperialism. And the anti-war movement was led by soldiers and students from working class backgrounds. They didn't have the same allegiance to imperialism and to the state that previous generations did when university was a place just for the children of the rich and the upper middle clergy class. So professors like Chomsky and Parenti were a threat. But the administrators couldn't really do anything about Chomsky because he was tenured. And at the end of the day, he did his activism outside of his job, so the media would just black him out and slander him whenever they did talk about him. But guys like Parenti, without tenure, and who were directly teaching ideology, they got the short end of the stick. It's the same story with Norman Finkelstein. He went straight for the most uncompromising, hardcore radicalism while he was still a student, before he had any tenure or even any teaching job. So surprise, surprise, he got his ass whooped, and he ended up with no job for 15 years. Now eventually, the donors and the administrators figured out a neat trick to de-radicalize college kids. They withdrew funding from universities so that tuition exploded, and working class kids now had to go into massive debt to go to school, especially to elite schools, where you get all the connections to get all the fancy prominent positions. And what that meant is that the working class kids no longer had any time for activism or radicalism. They had to work part-time jobs while studying, and they had to go study in engineering and computer science and corporate law and finance careers where you get paid real money. They could no longer really afford to get careers in the luxury clergy class. And they couldn't afford to fuck around on campus and lower their grades. And this sounds like some kind of conspiracy theory, but whereas most of the stuff that I talk about is just about the natural effects of rich people being in charge of things, this was actually a deliberate plan. We'll talk about the Powell memo in another episode, but you can look that up now and what it says about university activism. So, as a result of these costs going up and working class kids fleeing the humanities for the money-making disciplines, the humanities and the arts, the fields where the neo-clergy are formed, they started to fill up more and more with rich kids. The kids that you need for the clergy class, because they can posture as radicals all they want, but at the end of the day, they don't want their inheritances to get confiscated any more than their rich donor parents do. So these kids still wanted to be badass left-wing radicals because culturally that's what was cool. But as rich kids, their idea of radicalism isn't anything real or practical. They're not interested in actually achieving equality for their Uber drivers and Deliveroo boys. What appeals to them is posturing and looking cool and looking like a radical and engaging in status competition for who's the most badass and who's the most radical and for being praised as genius intellectual elites. These are all the type of things that just rich people care about in general, whether they're pretending to be left-wingers or whether they're just open right-wingers. So, not coincidentally, this is when postmodernism takes over academia and the humanities. And postmodernism starts out with some very interesting and useful critiques of academia and of science. But then it quickly degenerates into a bunch of ridiculous posturing that rich kids love and that no one else understands because it's just fake radicalism. It basically preaches passivity and nihilism. You worship Foucault, but you don't do anything to change anything because you can't do anything to change anything. You should watch the debate between Foucault and Noam Chomsky. It's very funny because this debate is like a Rorschach test. Rich kids watch this and are like, wow, Foucault really whipped Chomsky's ass because they're saying blah, 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 blah. But Chomsky's actually whipping Foucault's ass because he's like, everything you're saying means that we can't do anything and we shouldn't try to do anything. I'm saying that we should actually try to do something. And that's what being on the left is all about. And the SJW politics that everyone hates nowadays is just sort of a dumbed down version. It's like a retarded baby of postmodernism. We'll do a proper episode on academia in the future, but what's important here is that the donors who fund grants and research professorships loved all this new dumb stuff, this gibberish, because it doesn't involve making the donors pay any more taxes on their wealth. So at that point, all the left-wing rich guy funding just went to all these wankers. And then all the radicals got called essentialist, which just means racist in postmodernist mishkabibble. And you'll see I'm going to do an episode in the future on how anyone who's actually doing anything good for anybody always gets called racist and sexist. And I'm also going to do an episode on how big donors have turned so much of left-wing academia and NGOs and activist groups into total caricature, cancel culture, garbage, cannibal idiots, because that's what serves the interest of rich people. And And like I said before, nowadays, as SJW politics are becoming less popular, the rich kids are now starting to posture as Maoists and Stalinists and Leninists. And these ideas are growing like a cancer on top of the existing cancer of SJW politics and postmodernism. And, ironically, in 2026, being a Maoist or Stalinist, which was a threat to the elites in the United States in 1970, is actually acceptable to the donor class. Because those $80,000 a year tuition Stalinists aren't actually a threat to anything when they preach for joining their imaginary non-existent party that the government can just infiltrate and blow up in 5 seconds if it ever did come into existence. Back to Chomsky and Parenti. At the end of the day, Chomsky and Parenti's politics are actually quite similar. People think there's some kind of huge chasm because Chomsky is associated with anarchism and Parenti is associated with Leninism, and Chomsky was a huge critic of Leninism. But if you look at their writing and speeches, you'll see that they both very harshly criticized American intervention against third world socialist states, including the Marxist-Leninist states like Cuba and Vietnam. And although Chomsky is a harsh critic of Leninism, he's always been much more reticent to critique third world countries who are fighting U.S. imperialism very harshly. And when he does call them out and criticize them, he usually also points out how American intervention incentivizes those states to become more authoritarian. Much like Parenti did in his chapter of Black Shirts and Reds, or the video clip that gets shared around as apologetics for Stalinism. The big difference between Chomsky and Parenti was just that Chomsky understands what socialism is and what its goals are, and Parenti didn't understand that. Parenti thought that because the communist countries delivered welfare states, that they were doing socialism in difficult conditions. Chomsky, on the other hand, understands that a welfare state is nice, but it's not socialism. Scandinavia has an extensive welfare state, but Scandinavian countries aren't socialist countries. They're welfare capitalist countries. Nazi Germany had a welfare state, but that didn't make it socialist. It was fascism. And Leninism and Trotskyism and Stalinism, they also aren't socialism. They're urban industrialization dictatorships with a welfare state where the ruling class waves red flags and uses words like socialism and communism to justify their continued rule. Socialism is fundamentally about democracy. It's when workers and consumers control the government that makes decisions that affect them. And they also control the industries and the workplaces that make the decisions that affect them. So Parenti thought that these countries were doing socialism in difficult conditions, and Chomsky thought that they generally weren't doing socialism at all. They were just doing anti-imperialism dictatorships in difficult conditions. And Chomsky was correct. And at the end of the day, one of the reasons that the countries which are ruled by communist parties are all dictatorships is because both the US and the USSR would just overthrow any country that was actually trying to do real socialism. Because real socialism, the type that Chomsky preaches, is a threat to both the US elites and Leninist party elites, and all these stupid little SJW elites, and the new Maoist and Stalinist elites, like all the fucking kids who pay $80,000 to go to school. Actual socialism is a threat to them, no matter what they say, even when they're pretend anarchists. Like we saw how they sabotaged Occupy Wall Street pretending to be anarchists. Like everything they do is bullshit. We need to wean ourselves away from elite ideas, elite perversions of left-wing ideas. And as we'll see in my series on the Russian Revolution, that while Western intervention did and does incentivize authoritarianism, the Soviet Marxist-Leninist system did not emerge because of Western intervention in difficult conditions. It emerged because the leaders of the Russian Revolution made some incredibly stupid mistakes after they took power. And they made these mistakes because of the interplay between their class perspectives, because they tended to be upper class, intellectual class, and between their rigid anti-peasant ideology, which was part of their upper class perspective, and also because of bad information. And they didn't get the full information because of their stupid class perspective and their rigid anti-peasant ideology. And as a result of these mistakes, they fucked up majorly and painted themselves into a corner where they needed to become authoritarian in order to survive with their heads intact. That's kind of all it is. Nothing glorious. And every other communist state just copied the authoritarian structure because that's the only way that you could get Soviet or Chinese patronage without the United States or the Soviet Union trying to overthrow you. And check out my first 2 videos on this and donate so that I can afford to take the time off that I need to finally make the big conclusion episode that everybody's been waiting for, including myself. So, I've talked a lot about a whole bunch of different topics around cancel culture and elitism and performative gasbags, and I've rolled them all up into this defense of Noam Chomsky. And there's a link in the bio so you can read my sources and you can decide what you think for yourself. Chomsky had a serious stroke a couple of years ago, so he can't defend himself from all these turkeys and wankers. But hopefully he thinks that it's beneath him anyways to address these fucking losers, and I hope he feels secure in his legacy that he devoted so much of his life to the cause of human rights and human equality, and that he's helped so many people understand the world around them, and he's empowered so many of us to actually go do something about it. And I hope that he takes his advice to Epstein and he's ignoring the press and enjoying his much-deserved retirement. And for everyone else, think seriously about how you can get politically involved to do something about the things you care about. Get together with a couple of friends and go to the municipal council meeting and push them on rent control, or turning municipal properties into no-equity co-ops, or join the local branch of a political party. Start a union at your workplace. Go join the DSA and steer them away from stupid SJW cancel politics. And just go out there and socialize. I don't know. It's not easy, but it's how change happens. And go out and check my other stuff and share it and like and subscribe, rate the show on the apps, and send me some money so that I can make this list of literally 34 videos that I'm working on. And until next time, see ya!